Picture a room with no windows, fluorescent light cutting across green felt. 8 people seated around a table, and not one of them is actually playing cards. They are reading each other. They are studying the half-second delay before a raise, the way a man shifts his weight when the turn card misses him, the barely visible tightening of a jaw when a bluff gets called on the river. Every piece of physical information matters. Every twitch, every breath pattern, every micro-expression that appears and disappears in 40 milliseconds is data. This is not a casino. This is a war room. And every single chip in the middle of that table was placed there by someone who believed they understood the battlefield they were walking into. Most of them were wrong, because the players who truly dominate this game do not think in cards. They think in systems. They think in probabilities, in psychological terrain, in the invisible architecture that structures every decision made at that table long before any cards are dealt. They have found something that most players never look for. A framework so powerful it was developed not by a poker player, but by a tormented mathematical genius sitting in a Princeton dormitory in 1950, staring at patterns that most human beings could not even perceive. And also by a Chinese general who never lost a single war, over 2,000 years before poker was even invented. 2 men separated by centuries and continents, 2 completely different disciplines, 2 ways of seeing the world that appear to have nothing in common. And yet together, without ever intending to, they wrote the most powerful strategic manual ever applied to the game of poker. Nobody pulled you aside and told you this. Nobody sat you down and explained what these 2 minds have to do with the decisions you are making every single night at the tables, till now. What you are about to learn in this video is not a list of tips. It is not a shortcut. It is not a collection of clever tricks that work sometimes and fail other times. It is a complete transformation in the way you see the game, the table, the opponents sitting across from you, and your own decision-making process under pressure. By the time this video ends, you will not look at a poker hand the same way again. Not as a gamble, not as a game of luck dressed up in strategy, but as a calculated engagement on a battlefield where the prepared mind, the disciplined mind, the mind that has studied what we are about to cover, wins over the unprepared one with a consistency that looks like genius from the outside, but is actually the result of a very specific and learnable way of thinking. This is the mind of a grinder, and this is where the real education begins. In 2001, a film called A Beautiful Mind introduced the world to one of the most brilliant and troubled intellects of the 20th century. John Forbes Nash Jr. was a mathematician at Princeton who carried a kind of perception that most people will never understand and most people would not want to. He did not see the world the way others did. He saw patterns underneath patterns, structures hiding behind what appeared to be randomness, order concealed within what everyone else experienced as chaos. And one night, in a completely ordinary bar, surrounded by his friends competing for attention in the most human and unscientific way imaginable, he had an insight so precise and so clear that it permanently changed how human beings understand competition, conflict, strategy, and rational decision-making across every domain imaginable. Nash was not looking at equations that night. He was watching social dynamics unfold in real time. He was watching people make choices based not just on what they personally wanted, but on what they expected everyone else around them to do in response. He saw the recursive nature of competitive decision-making. The way that your best move is always a function of what you believe your opponent's best move will be. And he asked a question that no one had articulated with such mathematical precision before. Is there a point in any competitive situation where no single participant can improve their outcome by changing only their own strategy, assuming everyone else keeps doing what they are doing? The answer was yes. And that point has a name: Nash Equilibrium. Here is what that means in plain language that you can take directly to the poker table. Imagine 2 players in a game. Each of them has a set of possible strategies available. The Nash Equilibrium is the specific combination of strategies where neither player can gain anything by switching to a different approach, given what the other player is already doing. It is the point of perfect strategic stability, the moment where both players are already playing their best possible game against one another, and any deviation from that point only hurts the person who deviates. Nash proved mathematically that every finite game, every competitive situation with a limited number of players and a limited set of possible choices has at least one equilibrium point. That was not just a mathematical result on paper. It was a philosophical revelation about the nature of every conflict that has ever existed. It meant that beneath every competition, no matter how emotional and chaotic and human it appears on the surface, there is a hidden logical structure, a perfect strategic answer, waiting patiently to be found by whoever is disciplined and intelligent enough to look for it. Nash suffered from severe paranoid schizophrenia. He heard voices that were not there. He saw patterns in newspapers and on walls that existed only in his deteriorating mind. He spent years in a world of delusion and fear so total that the people around him could not reach him. And yet, through all of that suffering, his mind produced something so clear and so true that it earned him the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1994. The man who could not trust his own perceptions gave the world the most precise framework for making perfectly rational decisions that has ever been constructed. Nash Equilibrium does not stay in textbooks. It does not stay in lecture halls or economics papers or the memories of people who studied game theory in college. It walks into every competitive environment on Earth. It sits down at your poker table. It plays against you every single night, whether you know it or not. And the question that determines so much of your long-term results in this game is a simple one. Do you recognize it when it arrives? In poker, the direct application of Nash Equilibrium lives most powerfully in a concept that serious players call GTO, which stands for Game Theory Optimal. GTO is the poker world's most sophisticated attempt to calculate the equilibrium point that Nash mathematically described, and to apply it specifically to the structure of no-limit Texas Holdem. The goal of GTO play is not to make exciting decisions, or to run clever plays that you can tell stories about after the session. The goal is to construct a complete strategy so perfectly balanced across all situations that no opponent on Earth can find a profitable way to exploit it over the long run. A GTO player is not optimizing against any specific individual at any specific moment. They are building toward the Nash Equilibrium point for poker, a comprehensive strategy that cannot be punished regardless of what any opponent chooses to do in response. Now let us talk about bluffing specifically, because no concept in poker illustrates the Nash Equilibrium more clearly or more practically than the question of bluffing frequency. When should you bluff? The answer that most players operate on is when they believe their opponent is likely to fold. The GTO answer is fundamentally different, colder, more precise, and far more powerful once you understand it. You should bluff when your bluffing frequency across all your hands in a given spot is calibrated so perfectly that your opponent becomes mathematically indifferent between calling you and folding. That specific point is the equilibrium. If you bluff too frequently, an intelligent opponent adjusts and calls you down constantly, printing money every time you have nothing. If you never bluff, that same intelligent opponent simply folds every time you show aggression, and your strong hands never get paid. The Nash Equilibrium in bluffing is the precise frequency at which your opponent earns the same expected value from calling as from folding. They cannot improve their result by doing either. They are strategically paralyzed. You have removed their ability to make a correct decision against you. That is not just good poker strategy. That is warfare. A balance in poker is one of the most misunderstood concepts that gets discussed in serious poker strategy circles, and the misunderstanding costs players enormous amounts of money every single year. Most players hear the word balance and think it means playing cautiously, playing small, not committing too many chips with uncertain hands. That interpretation is almost exactly backwards. Balance in the context of Nash Equilibrium means something completely different. It means constructing your betting ranges so that both your value hands and your bluffs appear with frequencies that make your overall strategy impossible to exploit. When you are genuinely balanced, when you bet strong hands and bluff hands with the same sizing and the same behavioral presentation, you force every opponent you face into a situation where no decision they make against you is clearly correct. They cannot fold because you might be bluffing. They cannot call because you might be value betting. They cannot raise because you have strong hands mixed into your range too. You have systematically removed all three of their weapons. That is not passive poker. That is total strategic domination through mathematical balance. Understanding this at a deep level changes everything about how you approach constructing your strategy at the table. You stop thinking about individual hands in isolation. You start thinking about your range as a complete portfolio of hands in every spot, and you think about how the decisions you make with the entire portfolio affect the profitability of every individual decision within it. You stop asking which specific hand do I have. You start asking what does my entire range of hands in this specific spot need to do in order to be unexploitable. That mental shift from hand-based thinking to range-based thinking is one of the most significant transitions a developing poker player can make. And when you layer the deliberate randomization that true Nash equilibrium requires on top of that range-based thinking, when you genuinely mix your strategies in proportions that match the equilibrium frequencies, you have built something that the vast majority of your opponents at any level are simply not equipped to defeat. The players who understand this at a deep level stop making decisions based solely on two cards. They start constructing their behavior at the table as a complete strategic performance across hundreds of hands, making sure that their value hands and their bluffs are distributed in exactly the proportions that the equilibrium demands. That discipline, applied consistently over time, is what transforms a player who sometimes wins into a player who consistently profits. 2,500 years ago in ancient China, a military general named Sun Tzu wrote a book so precise and so true that it has never stopped being relevant. Fewer than 14,000 words. A document you could read in a single afternoon. Rulers who absorbed it and applied it won wars against armies many times their size. Rulers who dismissed it as abstract philosophy lost kingdoms, lost armies, lost everything. Today, the art of war is required reading in military academies on every continent, in the strategic planning sessions of billion-dollar organizations, in the offices of negotiators and intelligence analysts and competitive professionals across every field imaginable. The principles inside it have been applied successfully to business, to sports, to law, to negotiation, to every domain where human beings compete for something they want. And if Sun Tzu were alive today, sitting down at a no-limit Texas Holdem table for the first time in his life, he would be among the most dangerous players in the room within hours. Not because he would understand pot odds immediately, not because he would have studied GTO charts, but because he understood something so fundamental about competition, about the management of information, about deception and psychology and the exploitation of opponent weaknesses, that the surface rules of whatever game you put him in would become almost secondary. He would see the game beneath the game immediately. The first principle you need to absorb from the art of war is this: know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you will never be defeated. In poker, this translates directly into two disciplines that most recreational players completely neglect. Opponent modeling is the art and science of building a detailed, accurate mental profile of every player at your table. What opening ranges do they use from each position? How do they respond to 3 bets in different stack depth situations? Do they fold too often to continuation bets on dry boards, or do they become stubborn and sticky with any piece of the flop? Do they slow play their strongest hands, or do they bet them fast for protection? What behavioral patterns emerge when they are strong? What changes when they are bluffing? This is not guesswork. It is systematic intelligence gathering. Every hand you observe that is not your own is a free data point about how your opponents think and play, and those data points compound into an enormous strategic advantage over anyone who is not collecting them. Think about what Sun Tzu would observe in just 30 minutes of watching a typical poker table. He would see players who have not gathered a single piece of intelligence about their opponents. He would see aggression deployed randomly with no targeting based on observed weakness. He would see players reacting to outcomes instead of executing plans. He would see the entire table playing as if the cards were the only variable that mattered. And he would see one enormous opportunity after another, left completely untouched, because nobody at that table had done the preparation that transforms raw competition into strategic domination. The second principle from the art of war that completely rewires how you should think about poker is this: appear weak when you are strong, and appear strong when you are weak. This is the philosophical foundation of all deception, and poker is a game built almost entirely on a single player's ability to control the image their opponents hold of them at any given moment. When you slow play the strongest hand you have been dealt in the last 2 hours, checking and calling down a street you would normally bet, you are appearing weak. You are manufacturing a false image of a player with a marginal hand, hoping your opponent continues bluffing into you or builds a pot with a hand they would not have continued with if you had shown strength earlier. When you 3-bet aggressively with suited connectors from the button, representing a range that looks like premium hands, you are appearing strong with a hand that in reality needs help from the board to develop into anything significant. Every check raise, every delayed continuation bet on a brick turn after showing weakness on the flop, every thin value bet that doubles as a credible bluff representation, every well-timed overbet on a river that puts your opponent to a maximum decision, these are performances. Calculated projections of a false image designed to make your opponent believe the exact opposite of what is actually true, at the exact moment when that belief is most expensive for them. The third principle of Sun Tzu that transforms poker thinking is equally important and even more actionable in real game conditions. Attack where your opponent is unprepared. Appear where you are not expected. In practical poker terms, this means identifying the specific spots where your opponents are structurally weak and attacking those spots with a frequency and intensity that a player who had not done the intelligence work would never have the confidence to apply. If a player folds to river raises 90% of the time when they face one, raise that player's river bets constantly because that territory is completely undefended, and every time you apply pressure there, you are taking free money. If a player calls too many flop continuation bets but folds on the turn almost always, call more pre-flop and give up the flop more freely, then fire your actual aggression on the turn, because that is where they have left themselves exposed. You are not being creative. You are being surgical. The player who understands deception as a system, not merely as an occasional clever bluff, is the player who controls the psychological narrative at every table they sit at. They decide what their opponents believe. They choose which signals to send and which to withhold. They are not reacting to the image their opponents project onto them. They are constructing the image they choose to project onto their opponents. That is a fundamentally different relationship with the game, and it is one of the most powerful advantages available to anyone willing to develop it deliberately. Now we arrive at the fusion. The place in this video where the two frameworks we have been building stop being parallel ideas and become one unified and complete approach to the game. Nash Equilibrium and the art of war are not in opposition to each other. They are not even in tension. They are complementary forces that address two different and equally essential dimensions of what it takes to be a complete poker player. Nash gives you the mathematical foundation, the understanding that your decisions do not exist in isolation, but within a complete system where every choice you make is optimal only in relation to what your opponents are doing, and where the goal is to find and occupy the equilibrium point where you cannot be exploited regardless of what they choose. Sun Tzu gives you the psychological and tactical layer that Nash's framework assumes, but does not teach. The understanding that this mathematical system is not being executed by rational agents in a laboratory. It is being executed by human beings with emotions and habits and blind spots and ego investments and tilting tendencies and all the glorious irrationality that makes poker both wildly profitable and endlessly fascinating. The player who plays pure GTO at all times is theoretically unexploitable, but in most real poker environments, they are leaving a significant amount of money on the table by failing to exploit the enormous and often obvious deviations from optimal play that their opponents are making in nearly every hand. The Nash Equilibrium tells you what to do when you lack specific and reliable information about how a specific opponent is deviating from equilibrium. It is your default. Your fortress. Sun Tzu tells you what to do when you have that information. When your intelligence gathering has revealed a specific weakness in a specific player at a specific stack depth in a specific situation. That is your offensive campaign. And the synthesis of the two, the ability to move fluidly between unexploitable baseline play and targeted exploitation based on live reads and observed tendencies, is what distinguishes a complete player from a player who has learned one half of the game. The elite player builds their GTO foundation first, internalizing the unexploitable baseline that Nash's framework prescribes. And then they layer Sun Tzu's intelligence-driven exploitation on top of that foundation, targeting specific weaknesses in specific opponents with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a commander who has done the reconnaissance before the battle begins. That combination, mathematical unexploitability as the baseline and targeted human exploitation as the offensive layer, is the complete game. Everything else is a piece of it. Mark, let us go somewhere most poker content refuses to take you. Let us talk about what happens inside your head during a session, because this is the dimension that breaks more genuinely skilled and knowledgeable poker players than any technical leak or strategic misunderstanding ever could. You can know every GTO frequency in every common spot. You can know Nash's bluffing ratios and calling frequencies and mixed strategy principles by heart. You can have studied Sun Tzu until you can recite his principles in your sleep. And then you sit down at a live table. You get your money in as a 73% favorite on the turn. You watch the river card destroy you for the third time in 2 hours, and you feel every carefully constructed piece of strategic architecture begin to crumble under the weight of a completely irrational but overwhelmingly powerful human emotional response. Tilt is not a character flaw. It is not a sign that you are weak or undisciplined or unsuited for this game. It is a normal human neurological response to perceived injustice in a high-stakes environment, and the fact that it feels so urgent and so real in the moment is a function of how your brain is wired, not a reflection of your intelligence or your character. But the way tilt manifests at the poker table, in decisions driven by the desire to get even, in aggression born from frustration rather than calculation, in calls made from ego rather than expected value, is the single most expensive pattern in the financial lives of most poker players at every stake level. Sun Tzu wrote extensively about the mental state of the commander. He described with remarkable precision the danger of leaders who allowed anger, pride, impatience, or the emotional need to recover lost face to override the tactical clarity that successful strategic execution demands. He understood something that modern sports psychology has confirmed repeatedly with empirical data. The quality of every decision made under pressure is determined first by the internal state of the person making it, and only second by the external information available to them in that moment. Nash's framework adds a layer to this that is both mathematical and deeply liberating. When you genuinely understand that you are playing correctly, when you have internalized at a deep level that your strategy is balanced and theoretically sound, the emotional weight of individual bad outcomes changes completely. A correct process that produces a bad result in one instance is not a mistake. It is and variance over a large enough sample of correct decisions always resolves in favor of the player whose process is right. Here is the truth that connects everything in this video, and it is the truth that separates the players who plateau after a certain point and never move beyond it from the players who keep developing and keep growing and keep adding layers to their game that their opponents never see coming. Strategy and mental discipline are not two different subjects that belong in two different conversations. They are not the technical game on one side and the soft game on the other. They are the two sides of the same weapon, and a weapon with only one side is not a weapon at all. A razor-sharp blade with no handle is something you cannot use without hurting yourself. A handle with no blade is something you can hold, but cannot fight with. You need both. Built together, trained together, applied together in real game conditions where real pressure tests whether the construction actually holds. The players who reach the highest levels of this game, who sustain consistent results over years and decades rather than running well for a quarter and then giving it all back, are not necessarily the most naturally gifted. They are the ones who understood early that complete development required attacking every dimension of what the game demands simultaneously. Technical understanding of the mathematical structure of the game. Psychological understanding of the human beings they sit across from at every table, and honest, unflinching self-knowledge about their own patterns, their own leaks, their own emotional tendencies under different kinds of pressure. This is the exact philosophy behind the Mind of a Grinder complete ebook collection. 10 books built to cover every dimension of what it actually takes to develop into a complete, dangerous, strategically sophisticated poker player. Not shortcuts. Not generic advice that works at the beginner level and falls apart when the games get serious. A comprehensive educational system designed specifically for the player who has decided that improvement is not optional, that the game deserves serious study, and that the mind sitting behind the cards is the most important variable in every result they will ever produce. The collection covers range construction, GTO fundamentals, exploitative adjustment frameworks, tournament strategy at multiple stack depths, cash game dynamics across different formats, the mental game frameworks that hold everything else together under pressure, bankroll management principles, opponent profiling systems, advanced bluffing theory, and bet-sizing logic that changes how you see every street of every hand. Everything we have explored in this video, taken to a level of depth and practical detail that actually changes the quality of your decisions at real tables. The complete collection is available through the link in the description right now. 10 books. One complete system. The investment that serious players make. John Nash sat in an ordinary bar in Princeton and saw, in the middle of the most common kind of human social competition, the hidden mathematical order that underlies every conflict that has ever existed. He saw the structure beneath the chaos. He built a proof that told the world that beneath every competition there is a logical framework, a perfect answer waiting for whoever is disciplined and brilliant enough to find it. Sun Tzu stood on battlefields 2,500 years ago and looked at war, at the most violent and chaotic expression of human competition imaginable, and extracted from it principles of strategic thinking so clear and so true that they have never stopped applying to every meaningful competition that has occurred in the 25 centuries since he wrote them down. Both men were looking at the same fundamental reality through completely different lenses. The structure of intelligent conflict. The precise way that thinking human beings make decisions when outcomes depend not only on their own choices, but on the interacting choices of every other participant in the game simultaneously. Poker is that structure made tangible and real and personal in a way that almost no other arena in ordinary human life can match. It puts you in a room with felt and chips and cards and other human beings carrying all their complexity, their brilliance, their weakness, their habits, their fears, and their blind spots. And it asks you to outthink every single one of them consistently, over the long run, using nothing but the quality of your strategic preparation and the discipline of your execution. The cards are not the game. The cards are the mechanism that creates the situations. The game is the war of information and deception, and psychological pressure and strategic positioning that happens across every hand, every session, every moment of every decision you face at that table. You watched this entire video. You are still here. And that tells me something important about you. It tells me you are not here because you enjoy gambling. You are here because somewhere inside you there is a strategist who senses that this game has a depth that you have not yet fully reached, and who wants the framework and the tools and the knowledge to reach it. The Complete Mind of a Grinder ebook collection is that framework. 10 books. Every dimension of the game covered at the depth that real improvement requires. The link is in the description. The decision is yours. The cards you are dealt are the situation. What you do with them is the strategy. What you build across a career of serious, disciplined, deliberate study is the mind of a grinder. Welcome to the next level.